Hello and welcome to AviaDev Insight Africa, the podcast offering a window to the world of African aviation with your host, John Howell, CEO and founder of AviaDev Africa. Some of you may or may not know that as well as being the CEO of AviaDev, I'm also a visiting professor at Coventry University here in the UK. And for the last 7 years, I've been going down to the university and delivering an annual lecture on African aviation industry, because the university and the aviation management course offers a module on emerging markets. Now, as part of that, I obviously love to shed a bit of light on that market and maybe inspire a couple of people to look into that in a little bit more detail. And even before this year's visit, actually, today's guest got in touch with me and we already started to plan his project. So he reached out to me on LinkedIn and we worked together on this, and that's what we're going to talk about today. But the one promise that I did make to our guest, Jacob, today was that if he got a first class qualification in his degree, which I did not, then I would bring him onto the podcast to talk about his findings. So here we are. Jacob Rogers, it is great to have you with us on the AviaDev podcast. Welcome.
Thanks, John. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, congrats on the first class and the graduation, and we'll get into what you're doing at the moment in a short while. But I think, why don't we just start with, tell us a little bit about you and also what got you interested in African aviation?
Yeah, I actually always had an interest in aviation. Wanted to be a pilot and started looking at becoming a pilot, realized it was going to cost money. I'm 6'8" as well, so training would have been quite difficult in a Cessna or one of the little tiny aircraft. So I ended up discovering the business side, got really interested in actually running aviation and interested in finding out how it all worked. And then ended up at Coventry studying aviation management. And then to say African aviation, my brother moved to Kenya about 8 years ago. So I go out there every single year, started looking at, even the first time I flew into Nairobi, just seeing how the inefficiency of the airport compared to Western aviation, and Western airports sparked an interest almost like instantaneously. It's improved compared to 8 years ago, but that kick-started my interest, started looking at how African aviation works compared to the West. And then at uni, all my research projects where I had the chance, I started investigating African aviation. So I think the first one was actually forecasting the Kenyan aviation growth, passenger numbers over the next God knows how many years, which was quite interesting. And then it came to, I found AviaDev, started listening to AviaDev, I think top 1% of listeners at one point. And then I'm still there now, still looking, still find it really interesting, and just started finding Africa has so much potential. How do you make that work and how do you do it is what captivated me. So then, yeah, that's how we ended up doing my dissertation on African aviation, really.
Yeah, fantastic. Your story is very similar to mine in that I just felt like a lot of the other markets had been explored and had got very mature, and it was almost trying to solve this conundrum. What is holding it back? What is the problem? And of course, we know it's a myriad of things. But your brother, where is he in Kenya? He's on the coast, isn't he?
Yeah, he's on the coast in Watamu. So I always fly into Nairobi and then end up getting Jambo Jet on the Q400 down to Malindi, which I think is one of my favorite flights to do. Great scenery, great flight. And I think that was actually probably is one of my favorite flights to do. Yeah.
Cool. So we've got a turboprop fan in the house. I'm sure my friends at James from de Havilland will be very happy to hear about that for sure. Let's talk about the dissertation itself and let's talk about the objective. What was it that you set out to achieve with your dissertation when you started thinking about it?
Yeah. So, and obviously I've mentioned before about looking at doing coursework on Africa and everything. So I knew from the get-go, my dissertation, my research project, if I wanted to do something in Africa. Obviously, SATAM, the single African transport market, was an answer to how to make African aviation developed and interesting. So that was my original goal, to do something around SATAM. But it's already a very researched topic and a very sound concept that I thought my potential to do research that was impactful wasn't really there. So I started researching more and digging in. SATAM has the pillars for implementation, which I found during a deep dive. And one of them stood out, which was the human capacity development, skills and personnel pipeline, which I already have done some, like my advantage modules at uni were on leadership and development. So I thought, oh, cool. Like I can mix my leadership and development, what I have a sub-interest in, with my main interest. So I went down that route, and then human capacity development was where I was going. It's essential, I found, for Africa to join the global powerhouse in general, not just aviation, is they need to understand and implement human capacity development. But that scope was far too big to do a dissertation on. So I started looking into how can you make human capacity development possible. And then leadership is an integral part of capacity building. So I started looking there. Africa's had a lot of aviation failure and a lot of management failure, and poor development can be derived from poor leadership. So that's where I started going down, and I found the leadership aspect. So in the end, my goal was leadership based, which will then help human capacity development, which will then help SATHAM. So I ended up fixing on a title, looking at leadership. What's wrong with leadership? Looking into Western context, there's a lack of African focused leadership research. The Western models that are very popular and there's lots of research don't fit Africa, and they don't take into account African culture on a daily basis and the ways Africa just works in general. So my thought then was, let's look at leadership in Africa and how to make leadership in the aviation industry successful, to then work all the way back up, if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. I actually don't remember hearing that sort of train of thought. So it's really clear, actually, that you started with the massive projects. I think you and I had a chat about that. And I said, with your supervisor, I said, look, don't try and take on SATAM. You won't find anything new, and you will come up with the idea that, yes, this is a great idea, but here are all the reasons why not. And it seemed the leadership thing could have been way more positive. And that's something that we always accentuate, is let's laud where it's been positive. So before we get into kind of the findings, the methodology, and obviously put you in touch with a few people, but you talked to quite a few impressive leaders. I'm not sure you can actually disclose who they were, but talk to us about how you did the research.
Yes, I did a very substantial preliminary literature review focused on what research is already out there in leadership. That kind of took a Western context, and then I started moving towards Africa and breaking down the research that is there currently in Africa, what's wrong, and kind of like what I can do to make it better. And that kind of set out like my research scope of, okay, let's culture everything, leadership styles. And then I was like, how am I going to get my data? So you came in handy and gave me access to your network. And I did 6 interviews in the end, I think, with C-suite managers from the airline side of African aviation. They were, I'm not going to name them, obviously, because I'm trying to publish a paper as well. I can't name them just yet.
Fantastic.
For paper reason. But they provided me with next level information that I couldn't have got from anywhere else, straight from people who have worked in the industry, and they've got the knowledge that I needed to make this work. And they came from a mix of backgrounds. So people who never lived in Africa before moved to Africa to start working, people who've grown up and worked their way through African aviation from the bottom to the top, loads of different backgrounds, which was really good. But that didn't really quite give me enough data. So I also used your AviaDev podcast. I think I did the Lifetime Achievement Awards, really, and looking at people's careers within Africa, and they were really inspirational in how they've led their careers and how they've led the workforce. So I think there were 6 of them that I used as well. So total 12 interviews that I then went through and listened to step by step and coded each individual word pretty much near enough into themes. And then over time, these themes built up into a framework that I produced to make leadership successful. So it's not really a theory, and I've not really made a theory for African aviation, but it's more an implementation framework to... I broke Western leadership down into the key principles, and then I've rebuilt it to be able to develop it into Africa.
Yeah, obviously, I've had the privilege of being able to read this, and fingers crossed that you get it published and everybody else can have a read as well. But I think just to dive into the findings as much as anything else, and some of the things that really stood out from it, in terms of the leadership styles, have you seen any significant differences in African leadership styles versus the sort of typical styles that listeners would be aware of, even if they haven't done the deep dive into leadership that you have, but they'll be aware of the sort of different levels of and types of leaders.
Yeah, so like my original literature review, I keep saying this, like African leadership does not fit into a specific Western style, and the culture is often omitted. And my research found out that culture is probably the most important part to leading within Africa. And airline leadership specifically needs culture to be able to operate and to be able to run smoothly. You need to have a core culture, and that's not just personal culture, that's organizational culture. So both need to be able to operate simultaneously, and a leader's the one who needs to implement that. And Western leadership tends to omit culture altogether. And so that was my main focus point, was on the culture. But then to compare against the West, there was a lot of similarities in terms of contingency, participative theory, relational and situational. So they're like situational and contingency all depend on the situation at hand. So your leadership style is dynamic. It's never the same. Participative is, I always see it as a mum and dad situation. Like you guide the employees, you're not getting involved. You don't want to micromanage, and you don't want to swaddle them. You swaddle your employees, but you want to guide them that was participative. And then relational is forming those bonds. So your employees aren't seen as just items or equipment. They're people, and you need to have a relationship with them that is not just one directional, it's a two-directional relationship with your employees. So it supports the idea that to strip it all back and get the key qualities from each individual theory was needed and rebuild it in the African context is what I tried to do, and what I could see was a possibility. And I've said there's no same perfect way to lead. So I didn't want to create a theory and say this is what you need to do and this is how you do it, because especially in Africa, across the world really, you can't lead the same in every situation. You could have especially in aviation, you could have an emergency on hand one day where you don't have time to have a relation with someone. You need something done and you need it doing now. Or you're planning for the future. You've got time to have that relationship and that cordial relationship going. So every situation is different, and the framework allows a leader to easily assess that situation and create a leadership style specific for them, their employees, the company, and they can change it and adapt it depending on the needs at the time.
Maybe you should create chameleon leadership as a style. That's the thing. Suit your environment and your surrounding. I think the thing that's really interesting for me is, of course, culture is very important. And you're absolutely right to point out that depending on where you go, cultures can be very relaxed or quite combative, and that's normal. It just depends where you move within Africa, within the world as well. But of course, from a leadership perspective, a lot of countries in Africa are led by strong leaders that believe that's the only way to keep an order in place. Did you find there was a lot of that, and whether that was a successful leadership style in Africa? And what were your thoughts on the sort of authoritarian kind of approach?
I think there was some aspects of it shown, but not fully. And I think it can work, but not in the traditional aspect. It's an adapted authoritarian to the situation. So I think definitely at times you do need to be authoritarian. I'm not saying you can't be. The research showed that, as I said, an emergency situation or something, at times you do need that authoritarian approach. But I think it's to be successful in the long term, you need to move away from that authoritarian and have a cordial relationship with your employees. You need to have respect cultures. You need to be adaptive to the situation, and authoritarian styles don't really allow that relationship or that style to happen.
No, I think that's very fair. And what about surprises? So you must have, had a hypothesis in your head, but anything particularly that sort of jumped out at you during the course of your research as a surprise?
I actually, honestly, the culture was a big surprise. I knew it would be a key part of leadership, but I think within Kenya specifically, I think there's 42 different tribal groups. So personal culture is massive in terms of your language, the way you live your life and the way you operate on a day-to-day basis. So I think that was a big surprise, and that's half the reason as well why I said you can't have one style, because there's so many different people to please. If you pick up one culture-based approach, you're going to omit people that don't fit into that category. So I think you really need to assess the situation. If you've got a smaller cultural scale, you can use parts of those cultures to build a strong leadership style. Or if you've got a wide array of cultures within your workforce, you focus on building an organizational culture that everyone can adopt to instead. And you then make the organizational culture kind of a second personal culture. Like you come to work and it's a new culture to adapt to, and you fit in and you make it welcoming and everyone equal. So I think that's really the biggest shock. But then I think one of the leaders described culture as like the breakfast of strategy. So I think like within Africa, if you don't have a good organizational culture, your strategy is not going to work because you're not going to be able to implement it. And without a strong culture, the organization will fail. But then also motivation. So I was just expecting pay-related, responsibility-related motivation incentives. But one of my favorite quotes as well was one of the leaders suggested pizza parties offering pizza as an incentive to motivate the workforce. So if you meet your targets, you get pizza. And I think I love that.
Yeah, I'm not sure the pizza and it depends on the culture, right? I can imagine that.
It depends on your workforce.
On your
But he was saying it worked really well for him and his company. So I think you've got to have that mindset, like you've got to think outside the box.
Yeah.
And you've got to give incentives. That would never have come to my head as an incentive.
Yeah.
But you've got to think outside and find something that will work for you. So it's not just money based and it's not just like responsibility based incentives. It's other things as well.
Yeah, look, I think you make some great points. Obviously, it was Drucker that said culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So it was like a bit of a twist on that quote. But what I would say on your point about the sort of the tribal divisions or the different tribes, it doesn't have to be divisions, but you think about a country like Nigeria where you have a large Muslim population in the north and a Christian population in the south, all these different tribes. Sometimes if you're a local homegrown leader, you're going to be related to one of those tribes. So you'll always have that badge. So you do understand, but you also belong to one. So I suppose the big question here, which isn't maybe one for you to answer now, is it better to be somebody that understands it from the inside? Or are you better to be parachuted in from outside saying, hey, I don't wear any badges and actually I don't know the culture, but I am willing to learn it. I am willing to understand it. I want to immerse myself into it, and then I can be a leader for everybody. I don't know whether those conversations came up because, of course, you will have leaders you interviewed that are born and bred African that then studied abroad and brought those ideas back. So that's like the hybrid of the two. Any thoughts on that?
So I think within my research that I did, there was some of the international leaders, you know, engaging on cultural exchanges with the workforce. As soon as they get there, they're accepting their mixing with the different cultures and whatnot. I think one of them went in and took a approach of I'm building an organizational culture rather than relating to the environment. So they were like the two approaches really that kind of fit. Even I think one of the African born and bred leaders focused primarily on building the organizational culture because he said like he can build a culture that he can get people to conform to and to fit to and to feel to flourish in that is irrelevant of where they're from and what they are. But then other leaders who were just as successful had those cultural exchanges throughout their everyday. So there's the two approaches, and I didn't really say which one is the best one. I just focused on you have to find some sort of cultural understanding within your company, whether that be personal cultural exchanges with the workforce, building an organizational culture that's community based and has values from the home life, or whether you build an organizational culture and you don't look at personal culture. You build a culture that is accepting to everyone no matter where you're from, and it parks your home life and you have a work life. But that is, I think, definitely room for further research in itself that I didn't have time to do. I obviously took it from leaders' perspectives, but I think if I to go back and do further research, I'd include employees and find out how employees feel and whether they would prefer their personal culture to be included or if they're happy to go to work and take a culture that is just the work culture and you won't find that outside the workforce. So yeah, definitely really interesting.
Yeah, I think there's definitely scope for further research, but it's a particularly interesting industry because, of course, it's a global industry with global standards when it comes to certain things. But so there are things that have to be globally accepted and met to a certain standard. So you can't just do it your own way. You've got to follow the principles of IATA, ICAO, whatever it may be, to be certified to be able to operate. I think that's a really good point to make as well. So before I let you go, in terms of the major takeaway that you think our listeners would be interested in, without giving it all away, just the sort of headline from the research.
I think the major takeaway is the framework that I produced at the end. It's how to implement successful leadership, and it's a never-ending circle of steps to commence and step through. So the first one is to set a direction. So like the company direction, work out where you want to go and what you want to be as an airline, as a business. That's the first step. After that, you need to build a dedicated team. So a team that is dedicated to the work of the airline, not to you as a leader, but to the airline, to build a strong an airline that is going to work. And then you need to empower and provide opportunities to that team as the third step. So whether that's through motivation, whether that's through responsibilities, you have to make them feel empowered to do that work and to build that strong airline. And then understand and engage them is the fourth step. So you need to constantly have those exchanges between them. You need to understand who they are as people and what they want, and engage and make sure that they're engaging with work. They feel part of it's them. They have a responsibility. It's up to them to make it successful, and they need to be involved in that process. The next one, number 5, develop and upskill. You can never not develop. There's always room for improvement. If they're learning on the job, going to training courses, they're going to become more and more dedicated to you and dedicated to making the company successful. And then the final step is to learn as a leader what's gone wrong, how to improve, reassess where you can change things, and then start the process again. Look at your direction. Can you change it? Go back around the whole circle. But then at every single stage, you need to intertwine culture, values, and attributes that are most important to you as a leader and to the organization. And these need to be coming through at every single stage to close the gaps and interlink and make everybody feel welcomed home. And then if you're leading and that's your way of leadership, then you're going to have a really successful company, really.
Right.
If the market's right.
I think that's really interesting. And it was great to read the framework at the end where there was actually something. I think the things I take away is it's a process of iteration, keep changing it, trialing it. If it doesn't work.
That nothing's the same for every situation. You need to constantly change, and you need to constantly look at where to improve. Don't get comfortable.
Exactly. So I think it's that, and the fact that obviously there is no cookie cutter. This will work in all African airlines in the same way that an airline business model doesn't work. And we've seen that where you've tried to import a model into a different continent, etc. And then the second point, which you made very well, is the leader should see themselves as a custodian of the business, who's the captain of the ship, but they can change and they can bring a new captain in. The ship's still going in the same direction. So it's not about the leader, it's about the leader feeling the responsibility for the organization is bigger than them. And that's when you find that these airlines have got a really strong direction of travel. And of course, the obvious one is Ethiopian with its Vision 2030, Vision 2040. It works.
Academy, they're training from the bottom up. They bring in unskilled people into the business who have no knowledge really of the aviation industry, and they're very impressionable people, and they're molding them to fit the company, and they're molding them to grow within the company.
But they're also molding them to believe they're doing a national service, because this is a government airline. So they've got the national pride, they've got the upskilling, and they've got the environment of people around them who've dedicated their lives to that sort of thing. And this is by no means the only place that happens, but it's just a really good example of it. So yeah, I think we've pulled some really good nuggets out of there. So I think the last thing I wanted to ask you, Jacob, is just tell us, you graduated over the summer. What are you doing now, and what's next on the career journey, and when can we see you working for an African airline?
So currently at Ryanair, getting some amazing experience in the low-cost market, which I think will be a game changer for Africa. Once SATAM is implemented, low cost is the way forward, not just in terms of aviation development, but in terms of development of the whole continent. So I'm getting some great experience, and then hopefully in the next few years learn some more at Ryanair, hopefully make the jump over to Africa at some point and make my mark and hopefully improve some leadership skills in Africa, or just even some airlines in Africa, and make it that little bit closer to being successful.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for engaging and doing this project, because I would say it was really interesting for us. I'm sure it will be interesting reading and interesting listening right now. So for anybody who is listening, I've put the link in the show notes so you can drop Jacob a LinkedIn connection request and join his network there. Obviously, once hopefully this is published, then he can share that with you as well. But do reach out to Jacob. But yeah, I just want to say, Jacob, it's been great working with you. Obviously, we'll continue that association. And yeah, good luck with everything with Ryanair.
Thank you very much, John. I couldn't have done the project without your help. So I'm dedicated to your effort. It was very helpful. Always indebted.
Thank you, mate. Thank you. I'll remember that. The next time I'm at the bar, I'll remember that. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody out there, for listening. If you did enjoy the conversation, if there's somebody in your network you think would benefit from having a listen, hit the share button now, share it with that person, and we'll be back for the next episode very soon. Thank you all for joining us. Bye-bye for now.